There was an article that was purported to have been written by her in one of the magazine, one of the Star or whatever those terrible things are, in which she made certain assertions and accusations that none of us ever believed a word of it.
There are moments in television history that feel like watching something sacred being slowly dismantled in front of your eyes. Not through dramatic scandal, not through a single catastrophic decision, but through a sequence of choices so careless, so blindly commercial, that they transform one of the most beloved farewells in American broadcasting into something that left millions of viewers feeling confused, cheated, and quietly heartbroken. The story of how Happy Days left the airwaves is not simply the story of a show ending. It is the story of how a network nearly erased 11 years of emotional investment in the space of a single summer, and why the wound it left behind never fully healed. To understand the full weight of what happened, you have to go back to where the trouble really began, because the crisis at the end of Happy Days did not start in its final season. It started years earlier in a conference room where network executives sat across from a young actor named Ron Howard and floated an idea that, had it succeeded, might have unraveled the entire fabric of the show long before its finale ever arrived. By the mid-1970s, Happy Days had grown into something genuinely rare in American television. It was not merely a rating success. It was a weekly ritual for millions of families, a show that felt less like entertainment and more like a standing invitation to sit down and spend time with people you had come to genuinely care about. The Cunningham family of Milwaukee had become, in a very real sense, a second family for much of the country. But something was shifting behind the scenes. A character who had been introduced as a leather-jacketed background figure, a biker with a few throwaway lines per episode, had somehow caught fire. Arthur Fonzarelli, played by Henry Winkler, had graduated from the margins of the show to its absolute center, at least as far as the audience was concerned. Merchandise bearing his image flew off store shelves. Fan mail addressed to Fonzie arrived in quantities that dwarfed everything else combined. Advertisers noticed. Executives noticed. And somewhere in that process of noticing, someone had what must have seemed like a brilliant idea. Why not rename the show entirely and put Fonzie's name in the title? Ron Howard, who had anchored the series since its very first episode and built Richie Cunningham into one of television's most recognizable characters, did not hesitate when he heard the proposal. His response was immediate and absolute. If the title changed, he was leaving, not threatening to renegotiate his contract, not asking for a larger share of the profits. Leaving. What made that stand so remarkable was not simply its firmness, but its clarity of vision. Howard, still in his early 20s at the time, understood something the executives in that room seemed unable or unwilling to grasp. Happy Days was not a vehicle for any single character. It was an ecosystem, and every element within it depended on every other. Fonzie's cool only registered as cool because it existed in contrast to Richie's earnestness, Marion's warmth, Howard Cunningham's steady reliability. Pull one piece out, and the whole architecture collapses. What made the moment even more striking was that Henry Winkler himself agreed. Here was the man whose name they want to put in lights, the person who stood to gain the most from being officially crowned the show's lead. And he stood beside Howard and told the network they were wrong. He said plainly that his success was inseparable from the ensemble around him. There was something almost unusual about that level of self-awareness, a star acknowledging that his stardom was a collective achievement. Together, the two actors forced ABC to back down and the show kept its name. But the damage, in a quieter sense, had already been done. The relationship between the creative team and the network had been tested, and the trust had cracked along its edges. Years passed, and Happy Days continued. Characters came and went. The show evolved, sometimes gracefully and sometimes not, but endured. By 1983, it was into its 11th season, and conversations about how to bring things to a close were beginning in earnest. Creator Gary Marshall had a vision for the finale, and it was bold in a way that almost no one in television had attempted before. He wanted the show's final moments to involve something unprecedented, a direct acknowledgement between the fictional world and the real audience watching from their living rooms. In the language of performance, this is called breaking the fourth wall, and in the context of American network sitcoms in the early 1980s, it was considered borderline heretical. Marshall's specific idea was to have Howard Cunningham, the show's father figure played by Tom Bosley, turn and speak directly into the camera, not as a character confused about whether he was being filmed, but as a man fully aware that he'd spent 11 years in the homes of millions of strangers, and that those strangers deserved to be thanked. ABC executives were deeply uncomfortable with the concept. They raised objection after objection. The worry, stated repeatedly in meetings, was that breaking the fourth wall would shatter the illusion that the Cunningham family existed as real people in a real place, that it would cheapen everything the show had built by revealing the machinery underneath, that audiences would feel manipulated rather than moved. Marshall pushed back on every count. He argued that the audience was not fragile, that they had spent more than a decade with these characters, not because they were fooled into believing the Cunninghams were real, but because they had chosen to invest in them emotionally. Acknowledging that investment openly, he believed, was not a betrayal of the illusion. It was the most honest thing the show could do. Eventually, reluctantly, ABC gave him the green light, and when the finale titled passages aired on the 8th of May 1984, the moment arrived exactly as Marshall had envisioned it. Tom Bosley looked into the lens and spoke with the kind of quiet, unhurried sincerity that no scripted scene can manufacture unless the feeling behind it is genuine. He spoke about children grown and lives built and the simple joy of watching love pass from one generation to the next. And then he thanked the audience for being part of the family. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers who had been prepared for a sentimental goodbye found themselves genuinely undone. Letters poured in. Critics who had been ready to write the moment off as a cheap trick found themselves reconsidering. The scene worked not because it was technically innovative, though it was, but because it arrived with complete sincerity. It did not feel like a network stunt. It felt like someone you loved looking you in the eye and saying something they meant. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Happy Days had achieved something that almost no long-running television show manages. It had ended perfectly, and then ABC destroyed it. The chain of events that led to the destruction began months earlier, with a scheduling decision that was made for entirely unrelated reasons. In the winter of 1984, ABC was broadcasting the Winter Olympics from Sarajevo. The network had paid enormous sums for exclusive rights to the event and was naturally committed to clearing its prime-time schedule for the duration of the games. This meant that several shows, including Happy Days in its final season, were bumped from their regular slots for the duration of February. The displaced episodes were not reruns. They were new installments, produced specifically for that season, that simply had nowhere to go while the Olympics were running. When the games ended, the network was left holding a handful of episodes that had not yet aired. The show's official finale had already been scheduled for May. A reasonable solution might have been to air the displaced episodes before the finale, keeping the season in its intended order. Another reasonable solution might have been to simply hold the episodes back, to accept that some content would never see broadcast and that protecting the integrity of the show's ending was worth that cost. ABC chose neither of these options. Instead, the network ran the finale as planned in May, allowed millions of viewers to experience what they understood to be the end of Happy Days, and then weeks later, began airing the leftover episodes as though nothing had happened. The first of these ghost episodes appeared in early June, just weeks after Tom Bosley's farewell speech had reduced much of the country to tears. It was a perfectly ordinary installment of the show, unremarkable in almost every respect, which made it all the more bewildering. Viewers had grieved. They had processed. They had said goodbye. And now, without explanation or apology, the Cunningham family was back on their screens as though death had simply been a misunderstanding. More episodes followed through the summer. Each one landed with the strange, disorienting quality of a letter that arrives after a funeral, cheerful and oblivious, and completely at odds with the emotional reality of everyone reading it. By the time the last of these orphan episodes aired in late September of 1984, Happy Days had been technically off the air for months, and yet somehow still lumbering forward. The final broadcast, an episode in which Fonzie attempts to join Fraternal Lodge only to be subjected to humiliation by characters who were supposed to be his friends, bore no relationship to the dignity of the farewell that had preceded it. It was not an ending. It was not even a story worth telling. It was simply the bottom of the barrel, the last thing left after everything meaningful had already been used. And it became, by default, The last image millions of viewers would associate with a show that had once meant something genuine to them. The damage to the cast was real, even if it was distributed unevenly. Ron Howard had already effectively stepped back from the show before its final season, his attention and ambition having long since shifted toward directing. The finale disaster barely registered as a disruption to a career that was already ascending in a completely different direction. Within a decade, he would be among the most respected filmmakers in Hollywood, the botched ending of his old sitcom a footnote in a much larger story. But Henry Winkler's experience was more complicated and more painful. The Fonz had made him a cultural institution, and cultural institutions have a way of becoming prisons. Casting directors throughout the late 1980s saw the leather jacket when they looked at him, not the actor underneath it. The anticlimactic, undignified way the show had staggered to its end only deepened the wound. Winkler later described the period after Happy Days as one of genuine crisis, a time when the question of who he was without the character he had inhabited for a decade felt almost unanswerable. He had built something iconic and then had it collapse around him not through any failure of his own, but through the indifference of a network that treated his life's work like a scheduling variable. The reinvention that followed, the directing work, the supporting roles, the eventual breakthrough in Barry that finally earned him the Emmy he had long deserved, was hard-won and took years. For Erin Moran, who played Joni Cunningham, the aftermath was darker still. Typecasting, and particular cruelty that American entertainment reserves for women who were once young on television combined to make the years after Happy Days genuinely difficult. The spin-off she had staked part of her future on collapsed. Stability remained elusive. She died in 2017, carrying burdens that the public only learned about in pieces, long after it was too late to matter. Her story is a reminder that the careless ending of a television show is not merely an aesthetic failure. It has human consequences. What ABC's summer of leftover episodes ultimately cost Happy Days was not just a clean ending. It cost the show its dignity in retrospect. When people try to remember how Happy Days ended, there's a confusion at the heart of that memory. There was a real ending, the one Gary Marshall crafted and Tom Bosley delivered with unmistakable grace. And then there were the 5 episodes that came after, shapeless and purposeless, like furniture left on the street after a house has been sold. The network had, in its haste to avoid wasting broadcast content, managed to waste something far more valuable: the coherence of a legacy. Television has grown more protective of its finales in a decade since. Contractual provisions now exist specifically to prevent what happened to Happy Days from happening again. Networks understand, at least in principle, that a series ending is not interchangeable content to be shuffled around a scheduling grid. It is a promise made to an audience over years, and breaking it carries a cost that no amount of recovered advertising revenue can offset. Those rules exist in large part because of what happened in the summer of 1984, which is perhaps the only honorable thing that can be said about the whole affair. Happy Days deserve better. The people who made it deserve better. And the millions of viewers who had invited the Cunningham family into their homes for 11 years, who had cried genuine tears over Tom Bosley's farewell speech in May, only to find the show shuffling back to life a few weeks later, like something that had not gotten the message. They deserve better most of all. The scene that should have taken Happy Days off the air for good was perfect. It was the network that failed to let it stay that way.